Hello and welcome to the Your Financial Planning Maestro podcast. This podcast is aimed at financial advice professionals all around the world, but particularly in the UK, where we follow the journey of many hundreds of individual paraplanners, investment managers and financial advisors in becoming financial planning professionals and gaining their international certified financial planner license. We will be talking to a number of individuals about their journey to become CFP professionals and touching on other aspects of the profession along the way. I hope that you enjoy our podcast. Hello and welcome. I'm Jackie Lockie, your financial planning maestro. And in today's podcast, we are talking about something different to our normal subject matter of being a certified financial planner. And we are delving into the realms of how we help clients have a meaningful retirement. And so to that end, I'm joined by Dan Haylett, who is a part owner and director of TFP Financial Planning, runs his own podcast called Humans versus Retirement, and also is an author of the recently published The Retirement You Didn't See Coming book. So Dan, a warm welcome from all of our regular listeners here. And I know that we're going to get into a lot of information very quickly. But before we get cracking, please could you just give us a quick potted history of how you got into the financial planning profession?
Yeah, hi Jackie. Thanks for having us on. Yes, it's nice being this side of the mic. You mentioned my podcast, so this is lovely. I can just have a good conversation, not worry about the editing and everything that happens afterwards. So, thank you for inviting me on the show. So I got into financial planning, or kind of, I suppose, the wider industry quite early on in my working career. I realised at about 19 that my cricket career probably wasn't going to kind of give me the rewards I wanted to do. So for all of those international listeners, maybe Google what cricket is. I don't know whether people know what that is outside of England. But I that was kind of my first career path really. And then 1920. I decided to get a proper job, or thought I need to get a proper job. So one of the big employers in my local town was M&G Investments, big investment house over here in the UK, and has since been obviously gone global. And I joined the financial industry at that point. And then worked my way through that business in the sense that I made it through to dealing with financial advisors. So I would speak to, on a regular basis, financial advisors across the UK, talking to them about their investment propositions. Now, back then, it was a very, very different environment to the way that financial advisors built portfolios, chose their funds, etc. And that environment then led me to do other things in that space. So I worked my way up to head of regional sales at Legal and General Investment Management, and I would be touring the UK, meeting with financial advisors, and done that for around 10 years or so. And that led me to have a really good understanding. I went through the retail distribution review in terms of seeing how the impact of that kind of what the impact of that was on the financial planning profession, and met some wonderful people. And I suppose I saw in the nicest possible way, I saw the good, the bad and the ugly of financial advice in the UK. And I decided probably 3 to 5 years, I suppose, before I made the leap out of that particular career and into financial planning, that I wanted to do financial planning as a career, and managed to kind of, one circumstance led to another, which enabled me to come off the big corporate treadmill. I actually joke to my clients that I retired at 35 from a career and went and done something that had that I wanted to do, that had more purpose and meaning and more impact than what the corporate career was giving me. So I got into financial planning that way. I had a bit of a long held ambition for a number of years before doing it. I had very, very specific or specific set of beliefs and values, which I'm sure we'll probably get into soon, about what I wanted
Yeah.
to do as a financial planner and the kind of business I wanted to be able to join and the business I wanted to be able to co-create and be a part of. So, yeah, that's what kind of led me to to where I am now. Effectively,
Mm.
that was kind of a bit of a, that's a brief journey. There's lots of other things in between, but that's probably as brief as I'm going
Yes.
to make it.
Absolutely. And along the way there, you started to specialize in, retirement planning. So how did that come about, and why did you decide to concentrate your efforts making a difference in that area?
Yeah, I suppose I joked a little bit about 2 minutes ago about I retired early. What I went through was a massive life transition that involved, my family, emotions, money, etc. When I left what was a pretty well paid um, corporate job and went into something that, although had um, more long term purpose and ambition attached to it, was actually quite a scary leap for the family, really, from a financial point of view and a lifestyle point of view. Um, and so I become very early on a bit obsessed by life transitions. Um,
Mm.
and the wide impact that those life transitions have on our not just financial state, but also emotional state in relation to those financials as well. Um, and so that was something that was definitely in the back of my mind, and then entering into and actually doing the actual financial advice and seeing what I thought pretty early on was one of the most sought after client types in our profession. Lots of people want to work with retirees, but actually, I
Yeah.
thought, and maybe controversially, I thought quite underserved, because we dealt with the money, but never the kind of the other bits. Um, and so I felt like for me that where money meets these emotions is a real opportunity to work with people to make sure that their money has meaning and their money is aligned with their values. And I saw really early on, I was quite lucky in that I dealt with some people really early on that had wonderful financial plans, but were making no use of them. I.e., they were beautifully color coded. They were, never going to run out of money. They were brilliantly robust, yet something was just missing. And I kind of grasped hold of that in that the work that we do, the amount of work that we do as financial planners in making sure that the money and the plans and everything is robust. And yet I'm sitting in front of a couple and they look emotionally drained. I needed to marry the two up. Otherwise, I felt like what I was doing was going to be a waste of time. Um, and so
Mm.
I kind of went back to my own situation and I thought, well, actually, God, I went through that big transition. I can resonate, even though I'm in my early 40s, I can still resonate with someone in their mid 50s, early 60s, because the transition is very, very similar. And so, yeah, that's what kind of led me to it, really, Jackie. I was kind of like, do you know what?
Mm.
Lots of people are sought after in the retirement space because they've got money. But actually, I think they're underserved because actually we focus too much on the money,
Yeah.
and not enough on what the money is for and making the best use of their money. And that's what's
Yeah.
kind of led me
And
down the path, really, of where I am now.
And one of the things I wanted to talk to you about is how retirement has changed over the years because, you know, 20 years ago, 25 years ago, people were working into their 60s and 70s, flat out 5 days a week. And then I can remember probably, it must be nearly 20 years ago, people suddenly started talking in the advice world about financial independence and how it's not really retirement and all that kind of stuff. So just give us a synopsis of really what retirement means to people now.
Listen, I've dug loads into this. As I got more and more obsessed with this man-made thing that we've called retirement. I've got obsessed by the history, and I've done, I've had huge amounts of conversations on my podcast and off my podcast about this ever evolving retirement piece. So it's a really interesting question. And I ask my clients about their parents and their grandparents and what they observed. And you go back to the history of what this is. Um, I think it's twofold. I do think it's to do with money, and it is to do with kind of human evolution or aspiration, and that is that you think about what financially retirement was for people, our clients' parents and grandparents. It was probably financially much more simple, right? They didn't have
Yeah.
these defined contribution pensions. They had a defined benefit, a final salary. They were less aspirational, probably. I'm going to generalize a lot here, but they were kind of very happy with what they had. They got on with what they had. They didn't really. There wasn't this striving. That they worked, as you rightly said, until they probably couldn't work anymore. Work was much more manually demanding, much more labor demanding, physically demanding than knowledge work now. And so actually life was very, very different. And I think that's evolved rapidly over the last 20 years in both senses, right? Money
Mm.
has become something that a modern day retiree has to take on their shoulders pretty much in its entirety. Not many people now have any type of defined benefit. So all of the worries about market risk and running out and spending too much or spending too little, they've got fears now that play into our human brains. More so than ever, more so than their parents, more so than their grandparents. And when you look into the behaviors and our brains and our wiring, our brains aren't wired to deal with that. We're not wired to have those type of money worries, and it doesn't particularly play out well for our emotions. And then you add on to the fact that people are now more aspirational. The world is a smaller place. We can travel more. We want to be able to, I think people are more purposeful than they've ever been. They want to align their life. They're more value driven. They understand probably that they want to do things a bit sooner. They understand that working might be a very different thing. Knowledge work can be done anywhere at any age. So it's changed dramatically, where that retirement as a word has no real meaning anymore to people. So I talk about
Mm.
modern day retirement rebels a hell of a lot. I mean, I think Gen X retirees, and what I would say a modern day retirement rebel. These are people that are rewriting the script from a human point of view, but the problem there comes that they clash from a behavioural point of view when it comes to having the weight of money on their shoulders, understanding how to spend their money and spend their time. Isn't always particularly natural for these people. So yeah, I mean, it's changed dramatically, and
Yeah.
I think also the problem is people don't have a blueprint right now. There's no role model. There's no real kind of, oh,
Yeah.
actually, it's retirement's pretty simple. You work to 65, you get your pension. Your pension's worth X, and you live to that means. There's so many variables out there now, which causes people, one, there's a lot of choice and a lot of excitement, but two, there's a lot of angst, and real emotional attachment to kind of this second phase of life.
Yeah. And in a way, Dan, it's kind of like there's it's too much choice, isn't there?
Oh
Because and
yeah,
that that brings its own stress and expectations, and also for those who have children of their own, who Gen Xers who have children of their own, are also worried about them and about whether they want to get on the property ladder, whether to pay through university, which obviously wasn't the case for people approaching retirement now. So I think, not only have our brains are still wired the old way, if you like, and those expectations, but there are so many more choices to be made, and then so many more responsibilities that people are trying to take on as well, on top of it all, aren't there?
yeah. And listen, I mean, I love what we do, but I do think we don't help sometimes. In that the paradox of choice is massive, and the trouble is the more choice that we give them, and I think the wider industry can be at fault of this. The more choice the less that people take action. There's a wonderful study called the Jam Study in America, where they set up two jam stalls, and one of this big kind of market, and one of the jam stalls had 25 types of jam, and the other jam stall had 4 types of jam. And the one with 25 types of jam had more footfall, i.e., more people went and looked at it, and was trying to look at what different types of jam there was. But the one that had 4 types of jam sold more. They took more money. Um, and
Yeah.
that's true with what we do. I think the problem is, because there's this abundance of stuff now. There's products here and products there and this and that, and quite rightly, we want to make sure the clients are getting the good deal, and they're doing the thing. I often think that it feels like it kind of plays into the wrong side of the brain, that wiring side that we just talked about. When the left
Yeah.
side of the brain that talks about numbers, that we don't trust it. We're very skeptical. We're playing in there, and people just freeze when it comes to that. That's why I think there's a chronic underspending problem in retirement. I talk about this a lot. Because there's too much choice, right? There's too much out there. There's too much fear. There's too much noise. There's too much to read. And what our prehistoric brains will do is just shut everything down and go, well, if there's too much out there, then I'm just going to shut down because I don't know what to do. And then we see all these stats coming out about how people are really underspending in their retirement.
Yeah, and I saw some research recently that was talking about alluding to that, and alluding to that in the financial advice space. I see a lot of financial plans where people say to the client, well, I'm recommended this, but you could also consider XYZ on top of it. And I'm like, well, no, just tell them what you wanted to do. Tell them. Because this research says that the more options you give, the more choice you give, then the less likely, particularly where those important stresses are, like you said, about different transitions through their lives. When those are happening, giving people more choice makes actually everything grind to a halt, like you say, because they're completely overwhelmed, and their brains are shutting down, and also they're this talk of the kind of behavioral science side of it, where advisors are starting to use some of the behavioral finance aspects to guide clients to make their own decisions. And so there's this dichotomy, isn't there, of overwhelming clients with information and collaborating with clients in order to help them get what they want.
Yeah, and I think that's what Gen X people, I'm just in that category. I think about people that are between the ages of, say, 45 and 60. They want, I call it, they want us to kind of talk to them as a human being, co-create a plan with them, and understand their emotions and behaviors. So they want to co-create. They don't, they want to be told to a degree. They're coming to us for our advice, and I don't think we as financial planning professionals should shy away from telling people, if that makes sense. It sounds a bit of a strong word, but I liken
Yeah.
it. If I went to the vet and my dog was sick, and the vet said, your dog's really sick, but here are your 20 options for what's going to happen, I would say to the vet, what would you do if he was your dog? Like,
Yeah.
what's your opinion? Because you're the expert here. I would want that opinion. Now, if that opinion then enables me to make some kind of more simpler choices, then that's okay. But yeah, I think that's absolutely true. We've got to understand the human brain in terms of these decisions that are being made. There's more decisions to be made than ever for our clients, both not just through money but in life. It's more noisy, and we've got to make sure it's simpler for them so they understand what they're doing. Um,
Mm.
and that comes down to my core belief around around the whole financial planning profession, particularly in retirement, is that we are more guides than mechanics now. We need to make sure that we are storytellers. I talk about it as kind of like, it's narrative over the numbers, it's stories over the spreadsheets. It's the meaning over the money. There's plenty of different little analogies that I've got, but that to me is what
Yeah.
helps people really live the second half of their life with joy and freedom, not by blinding them with loads of other numbers. Because trust me, it just doesn't work. I've seen it, and it doesn't work.
Doesn't work. No. So let's talk about what the common mistakes are that clients tend to make when both in the run up to retirement and then into retirement. Because I know that recently I've seen you talk about, the danger years in the run up to retirement. Tell us a bit more about that. What is that dangerous period? And what should we as planners do to help clients through that?
Yeah, I call it the fragile decade, and it's there's a lot of people that have written about this period as well, the 5 years before and the 5 years after retirement, and I think one of the most common mistakes I see people make in the run up to retirement is they focus too much on the money, um, and
Mhm.
I think that is a lot down to um, kind of how it's been positioned by um, the wider industry, i.e., this is the retirement has been positioned as a maths problem. You solve the maths problem, you solve the retirement problem, and
Yep.
that simply is not the case. Retirement is more of a human problem than it is a maths problem. And in the run up to retirement, what we focus on is trying to solve a complicated maths equation at the expense of what you're retiring with and to. And so, one of the things for me is I think if you are 2 to 3 years away from retirement, you should be focusing 70 to 80% of your time thinking about what you're actually going to do on that Tuesday morning at 9:47 when the dog's looking at you going, why are you home still? Like that kind of moment, right? You need to, because
Yep.
retirement's 365 days a year, or, forget retirement. And if you leave, you're longing to leave a corporate career to go and do something else. These kind of things, you've got days back, you've got time back. What does it look like? Who are you going to spend it with? And all of that. So we focus too much on getting the numbers optimized when we know actually it's impossible to optimize the numbers because we don't know what the future holds. And so that's
Mhm.
one of the massive mistakes that I see people make. They believe that the numbers are going to solve the problem. And one of the biggest moments for me, Jackie, in this was when I started delving into complexity theory. And ultimately, that's kind of the difference between a complicated problem and a complex problem. And
Yep.
we have to understand that retirement is a deeply complex issue. It's human, it's emotional, it's engaging, it's a never ending loop. Whereas we treat it like this complicated maths problem that is solvable. And I kind of talk about this, right? It's kind of, you get a piece of IKEA furniture. That's a complicated problem. It might be missing a few screws and you might not be able to kind of read it, but it's a complicated problem. You follow the instructions, input, process output. That's a complicated problem. A complex problem. I've got two teenage daughters. Raising them is very, very complex, right? And it's a never-ending
Yep.
loop of emotions, and that's what retirement is. Retirement is this um, hugely complex issue. Is that annoying? That can you hear that
Yep.
siren? Sorry,
Yes.
hold on.
Right.
Right, we'll go back to that.
Go on. Carry on.
Yeah.
That's fine.
Retirement is a hugely complex problem that a lot of people, the public themselves, and financial advisors are trying to solve with complicated tools. And no spreadsheet is going to tell you what to do with your time. No spreadsheet is going to ask you, who are you, when you haven't got a business card with your title to hand out when someone says, what do you do? Um, and because it is a hugely complex issue, trying to solve it with complicated maths equations simply ends up in frustration and doubt and problems. So that's a massive thing in the lead up to retirement that I see. Too much focus on the numbers, not enough focus on what I would say is kind of the human element of going into the second half of life.
Yeah. And I have a really great example of that because a friend of mine worked 36 years, I think, at Honda in Swindon, and man and boy, whole time, worked there full time. And then when the factory shut down a couple of years ago now, he decided he was just coming up to 60. So he was like, right, I'm just going to retire. I'm sick of it all. I've worked there for all these decades and I've had enough. And he went into retirement. His numbers were all fine. Obviously, as financial planners, we helped him sort his situation out, and all the numbers were fine. And I said to him, have you actually thought about what it's going to be like? Because you've gone 36 years in you were fully controlled environment with a siren going off when you could have your lunch, when you could have your tea break, when you could go to the loo, all of these things. And then
Yep.
all of a sudden you can do whatever you like. And what was interesting was that for the first 3 months, he said, right, I've made this list. I'm going to decorate the whole house. I'm going to put fans in. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And what happened? Nothing.
Yep.
So 3 months, he did absolutely nothing, just completely overwhelmed by what the enormity of this list that he'd made, and started off with great intentions. And then he went from getting up at 7 o'clock every morning, which he had to for work, to be in work for 8, to getting up at 9, 9:30 in the morning. By the time he'd had breakfast and mooched about the garden, that the day was half gone. And then he felt guilty that he hadn't done anything. Then, his wife's still working. So he was then saying, right, well, I need to dart out and get some things for dinner because I need to cook dinner and I'm taking on that responsibility. And so he was just completely, unprepared for the realities of what happened in retirement. And so eventually what happened to him was, after about 6 months, another friend of mine who runs his own kitchen fitting business said to this guy, well, how about you come and work for me, just as doing little odd jobs, because he's a very manual worker, thinking through with his hands. And so he then went to work there, on a week a month, for about 7 or 8 months. And then the guy, the owner of the business, decided he was going to have 6 months off, which is where we are now. And when I saw him last week, I said to him, when the 6 months is up, are you going to go back? And he said no, because I feel like I'm ready. I've kind of got myself ready, and I'm retired now, so I want to stay retired. So I guess that's what we're talking about, isn't it? That, like you say, the numbers work, but actually the practical realities of, what time am I getting up? What am I doing to fill my days? How am I living a meaningful retirement that you mentioned in the book, is something that we just don't think about.
No, absolutely. And time, I'm sure we've all got, as financial planners, story after story after story um, about this, and that's the kind of thing I want to change, Jackie. I think, I believe that we are in the most privileged position to help our clients, and I know I get pushback around, what are you, a financial planner, or are you a life coach? Are you, what is this? And I actually think I'm a bit of everything, right? So um,
Mm.
I love human beings. I'm obsessed by our behaviors, particularly when it comes to money. And I just and I don't think, because I feel like I'm in that privileged position, I feel like I'm actually best placed out of anyone that my client will know to help them live a meaningful life. And money is a big part of, obviously, that, particularly in the retirement years. But I see it time and time again. I mean, in the book, I've created this thing called the retirement reinvention curve, which is a 3-phase, 8-stage emotional journey of retirement. And it isn't linear. You don't go through it stage by stage. You can miss a stage, you can go back a stage, it can take you 6 months to get to one stage. But the example you just give was kind of a typical what I see, right? Someone retires with this massive list of things, because what they think is, right, I need to finish on the Friday and I need to get up and like fill my diary on the Monday. Um, and there's a
Yep.
difference between filling your days and filling your days with meaning, or filling your days with stuff you want to. And people just feel that they say yes to everything. They end up full-time grandparents because all they do is they say yes to looking after their children. They say yes to doing stuff they don't want to do. I see it all the time. And what we get this kind of this retirement shock is a big thing. They've put a label on this and they've done some research, but people have shock, right? That first Monday morning after retiring, potentially no alarm clock, no commute, no emails, just this kind of space, and you get this kind of this real kind of panic around what does it mean. You then go into this honeymoon phase, what I've called elation. So, you go, well, this is brilliant, right? I'm in this bit, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, and I feel a bit more relaxed and all of that. And then we start unfolding a bit, kind of when unease starts creeping in, and then we start getting a bit frustrated because it's not quite giving us what we want. And at the bottom of the curve, we go into maybe doubt. Um, and that's where people go back to work, not because they're lacking income, they're just lacking identity. They're lacking a reason to pull
Yep.
back the duvet. So they end up going back to work, whether it's part time or whatever, because they have no idea what they're doing. Now, there is a 40% chance, sorry, you are 40% more likely to be clinically diagnosed with depression in retirement than if you're working. Um, and
Wow.
these stats are coming out now about this, right? If you're not, if you haven't replaced stuff that work gives you that isn't money, and replaced it with a bit more purpose and a bit more meaning and aligning it with some of your values, you can very quickly go into frustration and doubt and quite depressive states. And that's it. That's when people just go, oh, I'm going to go back to work because I've no idea what I'm doing. So I just do the status quo, even though they've wanted to get away from work for a number of years. They kind of put themselves back in that situation. Um, and so my big thing is, well, look, if we've created these wonderful financial plans, and we know that they can spend their money, and we know that they can take their time, and we know that they can align their money with all the things that they want to do, then surely we need to talk about this stuff and help them through this and educate them through these journeys that they will go on from a human and emotional perspective. And then allow them to come out the other side and really use their money for what they've saved 30, 40 years for. And that's be able to get some time back, get some freedom back, have control over your own destiny. But it takes a lot of work to be able to fulfill that time and control, doesn't it? And I think that's the problem. They haven't put
It
enough
does.
time into to do that because they've hidden behind the numbers. Because if the number's okay, I'm going to be okay. And
Yeah.
we know it simply
Yeah.
isn't the truth.
And let's talk about the 5 pillars that you talk about of thriving in retirement, because in the book you talk about purpose, identity, relationships, structure, and well-being. Talk us through those elements and how you see them bolting together to allow people to kind of flourish in their retirement.
Yeah. Um, and I think it comes back to what we've been saying. You know, this is purely human, right? This is kind of the human element of retirement. But actually, the money kind of does trickle its way through. The money is a big thread through this, right? I mean, it's a big, it's an emotional lightning rod. But
Mm.
when I talk about those 5 things, this is kind of saying, well, what's really important? Forget retirement, forget second half of life. I look at this and I think, what's really important for us as human beings to thrive? And actually, I don't know whether you would jot anything different down. If I said, if you're 30, what do you want in your life to be able to feel like you're thriving and you are living and you're happy and joyful? And I don't think they would be any different to these 5 potentially. Um, but the definitions around them become a bit different in my mind. So when I talk about purpose, this is things that pull you forward. And I'm not talking about kind of world changing, kind of rah rah TED talk level purpose, right? That's not what I'm saying. Um, Purpose
Yep.
isn't always big. It doesn't have to be big. In fact, the best kinds of purpose often aren't big. Jordan Grummett, who's a guest on my podcast, who's written a brilliant book called The Purpose Code, talks about big P purpose and little p purpose and how everybody is fixated on big P purpose, like change the world stuff. And that's not where joy and happiness and deep fulfillment comes from. You need something to get you out of bed that isn't breakfast, right? You need this kind of pull back the duvet moment for you. And it probably needs to be with a bit more vigor than when you went to work, right? Volunteering, teaching your grandkids to
Yep.
do something, learning how to do a new skill. One of the things I think you did, and I just want to quickly pull back to what you said about kind of a common mistake people make in retirement. And it comes back to this. I think people, they end up foregoing 2 things, curiosity and growth. I think we need to remain curious and we need to remain in a growth mindset. And and that's what we love as human beings. That kind of makes us move forward. I talk about pulling you forward. What's pulling you forward? You need to be curious and you need to be continuously thinking about growth. Now, that doesn't mean kind of, when everyone gets scared by the word growth, you just need to feel like you're stepping forward a bit. So, learning new skills and all that stuff, it doesn't have to be impressive. It just needs to matter to you. And it should change your day, not if you change the world, right? So I think purpose comes first in that, because I do think it is probably the fundamental thing that particularly modern day retirees, people in their 50s today, are thinking a lot more about. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And I think there are
Yeah.
probably a lot of modern day retirees who wouldn't have on their list of purpose looking after their grandkids 5 days a week.
No, absolutely, right. I mean, that's, the trouble is there's a default position. Um, and actually, I talk about this a lot to my clients, and it's in the book as well when I talk about time. And as I said, people often say yes to things, but also there's a whole group of people that are have good intentions, well intended, that are family and close friends, that might think that, oh, they've retired now, so they've got a load of time. So they will ask more of you. Can you come around and help me on the house? Can you look after the grandchildren? Can you look after the dog? Do you fancy coming out, for this thing? And one of the biggest skills I think in retirement is learning to say no. And I don't think enough
Mm.
people say no because they're scared of having a blank calendar. And that comes back to, the second pillar, identity, right? It's, I think there is an identity crisis that's really creeping up on people. When you're not managing director or head of or something anymore, who are you? And if that name badge goes and the job title vanishes, we get this little void creep in. If your calendar isn't filled up for you, if your meetings aren't there and your email box isn't inbox isn't full, we end up going, well, actually, I've been used to that for 20 years, so I better fill it because that's what gives me structure and purpose. And you just fill it with
Yeah.
another load of stuff that you don't want to do. So I think that's why it's so important to be able to understand what you want to do with your time and actually be comfortable in space. Because if you're comfortable with doing nothing, and I don't mean like sitting on the couch watching box sets, but if you're comfortable doing nothing, then actually you'll be able to say yes to the things that are meaningful to you and no to the things that will probably suck up your time and energy. I'm sure everyone would love to spend time with the grandchildren, but not every day, right? That's kind of, and I
Yeah.
do see it. I do see it a lot. And Jackie, one of the worst things I see actually is when people they cling on to old stories, right? I mean, I've when you go on holiday, you meet a few people and all of that, and you say, "What do you do?" And if you see people that are older and that, they often say, "Oh, I used to be," or
Yes.
I'm a retired something."
Yeah.
And here's the truth, right? You can't build a fulfilling future on a past identity. People are clinging on to who they used to be, and they haven't moved on. Um, and I think that's a problem. That's why I do think there's a bit of an identity crisis, because I think it's probably the hardest thing to feel like you're letting go of, particularly for successful people or people that have had, one track in their career or in their job for a vast number of years.
Yeah. And I think that's really fascinating because of all the clients I've met over the years and clients of friends who are financial planners at weddings and parties and general get togethers, I've only come across one person in all my time who is retired. And when I've asked them, are you still working? What do you do? They have just said, literally, I'm retired.
Mm,
Everybody else has said, I'm a retired, fill in the blank,
yep,
harking back to that past. And, the other thing that you mentioned there about, purpose is not the same as having a full diary. The structure of life is not the same as purpose, is it?
no,
Just filling it with stuff is not necessarily meaningful. And it's about trying to have that time to decide what you want and what fulfills you as an individual so that you can get to that point in life where somebody says to you, what are you up to? And you go, I'm retired, full stop. You don't have to
yeah,
explain who you were previously.
exactly. I mean, I get my clients to create a business card or do something around, if someone's going to ask you that question, what do you say? And I get them to get creative, right? It can be anything. It can be, I'm enjoying unstructured time. I'm a part-time gardener, part-time golfer, part-time volunteer. I'm a whatever you want to be. Or I'm living life happy. I don't know. There's you just get people to kind of talk about how they'd answer that question, um, and I think it's really important for people to frame that in their mind for them to be able to move forward with what their second half of life should deliver for them.
Mm. And in your chapter about relationships,
Yeah.
is that more about establishing where those boundaries, where you want to draw your boundaries with friends and family?
Yeah, there's a big part in that as well. I mean, I talk about retirement is not a solo sport, and I think that the thing about retirement is that um, it's a hugely disorientating time for relationships, and I think people underestimate it. And unfortunately, we have seen the kind of the grey divorce type thing. I mean, the stats I look at suggest that at 9% of all divorces back in 1990 were those over age 60. It's now 40% of all divorces are those over age 60. Now, I know there's a whole, there's different things at play there, and I'm not going to all attribute it down to this. But what I do know is that couples particularly, aren't having the conversations prior to pressing the button. And they assume that they both feel the same, and in fact they don't. And
Mm.
the trouble is, you've not really lived between the hours of 9 to 5 for so long, so you have a relationship that's going to change dramatically with your spouse. You have a relationship that's going to change dramatically with your children if you have children, and your grandchildren if you have grandchildren. Relationships will dramatically change with your friends. Men are horrendous at keeping friendship groups. Women are a lot better. I mean, that is just, there's lots of studies going on about, women find it a bit easier to have meaningful relationships, longer term relationships, particularly in the second half of life, than men do. But, it's if you're always at home together, then, you know, that's a brutal truth to kind of take on if you've not had that conversation with one
Yeah.
another. So I think, and also relationships are hugely important. In fact, they're probably the most important thing. The Harvard 80-year study that talks about what makes people happy during their life, and this is a big study for professors because it's been going for so many years, taking people from birth to death, found that the number one predictor of happiness in your life isn't money, isn't jobs, isn't success, it's relationships. Positive relationships make you happier and live longer. So we know the impact on us as human beings in having positive relationships. And in fact, that same study found that the number one challenge that people find in retirement is replacing the relationships that they had at work. So it's a big problem that I see, and if you don't work on it in those 5 years leading up to retirement, you're going to get into retirement and you're going to have some really brutal conversations. One of you is going to want to buy a camper van, and the other one is going to be wanting to move house and set up a new wildling garden. I mean, it's like people just don't talk about this stuff, and so we need to make sure that those relationships, and we understand that they're going to change, but then we need, as you rightly said, to understand there are absolute boundaries that need to be put in place to these relationships, particularly with family and friends, that will actually warrant and call more of your time as they feel like you've got more of it.
Mm. And one of those other structures that you've mentioned in the book is about client well-being as well.
Mm.
And that there again, all of these aspects that we've talked about today kind of filter into somebody's well-being, don't they? It's not just that one isolated area, alone, is it? Talk to us about all the specific things that you want clients to explore when they're thinking that run up and into retirement about their own individual well-being.
Yeah, I think if I put it into you think about physical well-being, mental well-being, but I think about it as kind of energy as well. So kind of physical energy, mental energy, and you know I, the kind of the lie that I think most people believe is that I'll automatically feel better once I stop working, and it's about making sure that you work on what's important to you, um, leading up to it, because the reality is when you stop working, you're going to stop moving as much. You're probably going to snack a bit more. um, that kind of thing starts coming in, and retirement will shine a spotlight on whatever you've neglected. If you've neglected your sleep, your diet, your mental health, your relationship with alcohol, your sense of self-worth, and all of that, if you don't think about those things leading up to it, and how you're going to plan to make sure that you sleep well. I mean, very early in the podcast, I had a sleep expert on that opened up my eyes about the importance of sleep, particularly as you get older. If
Mm.
you don't think about your diet, if you don't think about your kind of mental well-being, your physical muscle strength, if you don't think about your relationship with alcohol and food, if you haven't got to get up every morning for work and commute, it's very easy to grab a glass of wine every evening, right? I mean, I'm not saying it's a bad thing. Everyone needs to enjoy themselves, but it will absolutely shine a spotlight on what you've neglected. Um, and I
Mm.
think, if we're not, health is the vital thing that we have and we need to have in order to take advantage of those first kind of what I frame as those exploration go years. So, leading up to your early to mid 70s, whenever you decide to kind of give yourself more time and freedom, whatever that date is, you're going to have a period of time when health, and energy is more on your side than it's going to be as you progress and get older. You need to make sure you're in the right mental state, the right physical state, the right emotional state to be able to take advantage of that. Because if you're not, and you get to age 75 and you haven't taken advantage of it, the likelihood is you're never going to be able to.
Mm.
So that's why it's not a side quest. This well-being thing, it's kind of the foundation for everything that we've just talked about.
And the thing is, you don't want to get to 75 and think, I've got regrets. I wished I'd, done a bungee jump or skydiving or whatever it is.
Yeah,
And, it's not necessarily even those kinds of extreme sports, but, learning to play the piano or, swimming or running or whatever it might be. Um, if we don't act, we always think that we have more time, don't we?
yeah,
And actually, the reality is, each of us just have a limited amount of time and we don't know when that time's going to be up. And actually, when you're into retirement, particularly if you have already lost your own parents, then you feel your own mortality, don't you?
yeah,
And so then, but quite often that is a blocker, not a catalyst to look after yourself in order to be able to achieve some of those things perhaps that are on your bucket list,
yeah.
or this list that you've made that the day after you've retired.
Yeah, yeah. Jackie, it's one of my key two behavioural elements of retirement. I've got two key behaviours. One is spending your time, and the other one is spending your money. And I do think that we have a really rubbish relationship with time. We undervalue it. And if you think about how we've made our journey through life, most people's outlook is that money is scarce and time is abundant. And that's probably reasonably true. And I say that time is asymmetric, right? If you think between the ages of 20 and 30, there's not that much difference in kind of time. Between the ages of
Yeah,
40 and 50, a hell of a lot of difference, right?
yeah,
People say, that 10 years is massive. Between 50 and 60, massive difference. And the research suggests that every year past 60, there is a monumental shift in the difference that those years make. And what we're saying to people to do is that you're hardwired to go, right, money is scarce, time is abundant, and you hit a certain point in your life and you have to flip that round. And you have to go, oh, by the way, now money is abundant and time is scarce. And that actually is one of the biggest behavioral shifts that I think a lot of people have to make, to understand that you're now abundant on one and scarce on the other. And then you go, how the hell do I? Okay, how do I unwind 30 to 40 years of mindset and behaviors to flick this switch from a Friday night to a Monday morning? It's a massive challenge that we face as human beings, getting into this phase of life. And time isn't created equal. We know that there's a massive difference between our lifespan and our health span. And I think the more that we can help clients visualize their financial plans alongside well researched life stages and life plans, i.e., we know that time isn't what it once was in our 80s as it was in our 60s, and you build these plans with that evidence in mind, it really does hit home to people.
Yeah. And I was going to ask you actually, we're nearly out of time for the podcast, although frankly, I could talk to you all
No,
day, Dan.
no.
Um,
I did warn you at
but
the end. I do talk a lot, so at the start.
That's fine. Absolutely fine. Um, Thinking about what financial planners could do differently tomorrow to help their clients start to think about, those years prior to retirement of the things that they could plan and practically do now. What advice, what tips would you give other financial planners out there to help them set their clients on the right path?
Yeah, much like I've talked about, our clients need to be educated and in a kind of a mindset shift. I think we do as financial planners, and that shift to me is, as my good friends at the wonderful company Shaping Wealth, Brian Portnoy, who wrote The Geometry of Wealth, a great book, and Neil Page and Joy Leary. So they talk a lot about mechanic and guide in terms of two hats that financial planners and financial advisors wear. Um, I think we need to understand that we are more guide than mechanic. I'm not saying that the mechanic, the technical aspect of this job is not needed. It absolutely 100% is. But our mindset shift, I think, needs to go to one of we are a guide for an ever changing life for our clients. We are a guide for an ever changing landscape. Um, and we need to understand that is, that's part of our job. We need to be curious, we need to lean into this learning, we need to hold conversations better, and create ways to draw this out of people, and understand that we are in the most unique position to help our clients take full advantage of the hard work that they've put into their lives over the last 30 years. And actually, my mindset is, if I don't do it, I've got the I'm not saying that they won't, my clients or our clients won't do it, but my mindset is that they won't, if that makes sense. I'm like, if I don't do it,
Yep.
no one else is going to. And actually, they're going to have a worse life if I don't. So if we do really care about the outcomes that we deliver to our clients, which I know everybody does that's listening to this, then our mindset needs to shift. We are not financial planners and advisors anymore. We are guides, we are coaches, we are, I don't like using the word because I'm not qualified, but we are therapists, we are counselors, we are all of this stuff to our people, not in training, but we listen, and we understand the emotional aspect of what money brings to this stage of life. So it's about getting curious and a change of mindset. And holding space for these conversations and not jumping to the numbers too quickly. Because one thing I found early on in my career is, as soon as I jumped to the numbers, the conversations went off on a different angle.
Yep.
We were having good conversations, and then you'd get to the numbers part, and it would just dominate. There'd be 4 bars of red in their cash flow plan at age 96 to 100, and people got obsessed by those 4 bars. They were like, well, does that mean I can't spend as much then? It's because I don't want it to run out. Um, and so I think if we can hold space for those conversations, and understand that there are great ways that we can help people think about this. And one very quick tip, I know we're pretty much out of time, but one thing for me is when I started trying to become an educator. So I'm not necessarily worried about having these really in-depth conversations one-to-one in meetings. I do have them, and I want to have them. But part of me launching the podcast, part of my weekly newsletter, part of my YouTube channel, part of my worksheets that I produce and send out to clients is more educational. So this is kind of going, well, actually, if you thought about this, and if you thought about that, and next time I meet them, they go, oh, Dan, I downloaded your worksheet in your weekly newsletter about purpose. It was really insightful. Thanks for that. Can we have a conversation? So, build processes and procedures where we are drip feeding and educating clients about this stuff, and they will come to us with questions and an understanding. And again, great coaching, I think, makes people take action and make their own minds up, not having to tell them all the time what to do. So that mindset shift for us as financial planners to become educators, as well as facilitators of great conversations, I think is where we can really take this to the next level.
Dan, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. And for those who missed right at the start, I'm going to give you the details of Dan's book. So it is The Retirement You Didn't See Coming, a guide to the human side of retirement nobody warns you about. It's a fascinating read. I've really enjoyed reading it, Dan, and I have really enjoyed interviewing you on the podcast today. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Jackie. It's been a pleasure.
It's really interesting, isn't it, to listen to different people who have different experiences of gaining their certified financial planner certification or maybe developing the financial planning profession at large. If you know anybody who you think might be interested in listening to any of these podcasts, then please do pass on our details. That's it from me. I hope you've enjoyed today's episode. See you again soon. Bye for now.